stories that others can believe are their own.
Sabotaging Variations 3 until one of the musicians stopped him. The voice of Cage went on lecturing. After the performance, it was reported that Cage laughed, remarking, "It was like some kind of crazy bird got let loose." Lost in the vastness of the rock audience, the laser light show, and the smoke, the young celesta anarchist disappeared into the night.
Facebook devotee jokingly recorded multiple rehearsals of his suicide, and on the 30th day finally pulled the trigger, but no one knew if it was real or not. He finally got a lot of likes as his death passed into hyperreality without notice, until his account was deactivated by his own prior arrangement by a hacker drone he had found access to. On the 30th day, he left a note which read, "Finally, I have achieved thought, real thought, born of a failure to achieve an adequate response to the environment. Communication via the information explosion? Not a sign of progress, but maladaption. A maladaption eagerly sought after by an always absent other." on her strawberry croissant. She devoured the pastry hungrily, got back into the vehicle, and sped off into the matrix. Nightmare. Successfully and comfortably ensconced in a self-made world, a modern Pharisee who was a painter that followed music, came from working stock and therefore knew about hard work. He made sure his domain was fenced in well and shepherded properly as he threw up stilts to the world at large. He had emerged at the end of modernism's quest for autonomy and became one of its last defenders. After all, it was over. Modernism no longer represented the world view of the young, whose internet had changed everything. And now, postmodernism was over too, as it could not last without ironic injections of modernism to float on. What was the Pharisee to do? His modernism went underground and would re-emerge from time to time like a riverbed that turns up elsewhere, with its revivals kept alive by Europe's death tides. They had to put Maplethorpe next to Michelangelo to feel they had some energy. And then one day it happened. The Pharisee witnessed a performance by Lady Gaga of a Boulez remix and thought of his own dilemma. To his horror, what he thought of as the iconic dog-do of Lady Gaga, with its more palpable faults of the lower nature, like the publican and the sinner, was actually closer to the kingdom of heaven than the parched and fenced-off world the Pharisee kept for himself. The waif. She abdicated, preferring to give up rather than waiting for it to be taken away from her. Her mother told her, "You always hurt the one you love." Now, a former ghost of herself 5 years later, she spotted him immediately in a health food store, in spite of the fact that he was now completely gray. She looked right at him as she passed right out the door, carrying 2 bags, almost dragging on the floor from the weight of her frail frame. He caught her stare and, shocked by her countenance, a thin, Giacometti-like figure, her face seemed collapsed on itself, her beauty now gone. He looked again and asked, "Is that the hapless girl from the comedy of the real?" Dogtown, the dogs are not friendly. They are nasty and brutish and roam in packs, eating anything, even you. It had a doggone existence, if if not a dogged way of surviving that permeated everything. He abdicated his life for the dog money in order to survive, but was deeply aware he was really so much more than that. His resentment of his sons for the life he gave them was straight out of a novel by Paul Sage. Enraged Revenant. A self-styled elder antry-like preacher was in the habit of gravitating to college campuses, searching for Satan, like a bee attracted to honey. Holding court in the quad, he would hurl abuse in the name of the Lord, attacking students with a brew of fire and brimstone. When his sermon was challenged, he would shout at the puzzled young people how he hated them all and how they were going to hell. Continuing his onslaught of hurling nasty epitaphs at anyone who would listen, he yelled, "Hey you," to one young woman passing by, "You're obviously a lesbian and surely damned for all eternity." This particular group of students was ironically on their way to a class on postmodernism and entered the classroom completely upset by this display of conflict in consensual reality. The students thought the preacher was crazy and said so openly, as they discussed his madness among themselves, clearly upset and bewildered. Carefully as he prepared his notes, now saw an opportunity and decided to enter the conversation by opening his lecture with comments on the now distant but enraged Revenant outside the window. He took his students completely by surprise. He began with an observation that among the ranks of the evangelicals, this preacher was a bit unusual, as he opened up a borderline gray area of First Amendment rights concerning free speech and possible hate crime abuse. Then he engaged his students with the notion that the preacher was someone from another reality, a medieval reality, still alive and well in 2012. The professor, always concerned with primary sources, manifesting itself outside the student's window in Norman Cohen's book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, Revolutionary Millenarians and Mystical Anarchists of the Middle Ages. As he was also quick to point out the preacher's frequent references to Jesus and his certainty that this particular Jesus was the real Jesus was cause for concern. This, the professor called the preacher's utter desperation for a semblance of firm earth. Since this particular evangelical did not exist without an enemy, never mind, the preacher never asked those burning questions of papal debate. Did Christ own his own clothes? Did Christ laugh at the disastrous, heretical results of such questioning and slaughter? Never mind, he told them, that the Enlightenment project had relegated such millenarians to acts of barbarism. Never mind that the mindset under discussion had traveled across the Atlantic and settled in Ohio. For what the professor really wanted to demonstrate to his students by means of this fortunate and unexpected detour was how postmodern they really were, thereby validating the existence of postmodernism itself, which had previously been a point of contention. The professor concluded, no, this preacher was a revenant, waiting, watching, so not patiently waiting for the fall of Satan's postmodernism, so the world would go back to where it came from. After class was over, one particularly brilliant student who had been reading Bataille challenged the preacher, just for sport, as he later put it. A crowd began to gather to watch the debate. The student suggested that God was atheist to the preacher, and profoundly so. For, he went on, God had no knowledge of himself. If it were otherwise, he would cease to be God. At this statement, the preacher suddenly fell down to the ground, certain he had met Lucifer, while frothing at the mouth in an epileptic fit, until the paramedics took him away. who know nothing about climatology, i.e. the wrong kind of experts, to deceive a public that was all too willing to be deceived on the subject of global warming. After all, he said, for a nation that knows absolutely nothing about the Middle Ages, it's unthinkable. The playground must go on.